Before we begin, take a moment to tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? I read them all, and if you enjoyed these long, quiet journeys through history, please subscribe so you can join me again next time. Asterisk, before there was a Rome, before anyone could have imagined senators debating in marble halls or legions marching in perfect rhythm, the Tiber River moved at its own pace. Its slow, olive-green waters curled lazily through a patchwork of muddy banks, small groves of oak, and fields where wild grasses swayed in the breeze. The sound of rushing water was not constant. Some days the river whispered, other days it groaned and swelled, spilling onto low land. It was the river that first gave life to the people who settled here, long before anyone called them Romans. The landscape of the 9th and 8th centuries BCE was not one of grand buildings or even well-planned villages. It was a place of gradual, gathering scattered families who learned to place their huts in safer spots, avoiding the lowest ground where floods came suddenly in spring. They chose the slopes of the 7 hills, not because of strategy or urban planning, but because a small rise above the plain meant drier earth, fewer mosquitoes, and a better chance of seeing strangers before they arrived. The huts themselves were modest to the point of invisibility. Each was a small oval or round structure made from wooden poles stuck into the earth. The gaps woven with reeds or sticks and plastered with mud. The roof was thatched with straw, tied down with thin ropes of twisted plant fiber. The smoke from the central fire found its way out through the roof, darkening the straw over time until every home had a weathered, patchy look. These huts were temporary in nature, repaired each year after storms and the slow decay of material. They were not meant to last forever, only long enough to get through seasons. Daily life began with simple, repetitive work. Men and women woke before the first light to check the livestock, small herds of goats, a few sheep, sometimes a cow if the family was fortunate. The animals were more than food. They were wealth on 4 legs. Goats gave milk, sheep gave wool, and cows gave muscle for pulling loads. Children were taught early to walk the hillsides with their elders, keeping the animals close, watching for signs of sickness or predators. Wolves still roamed these lands, silent in the underbrush, and a careless shepherd could lose more than just a meal. The diet of these early settlers was not what we might imagine from later Roman banquets. It was mostly grains, emmer, wheat, barley, and millet. The grain was ground into a coarse flour and boiled into a thick porridge, sometimes flavored with herbs or bits of cheese. Bread was rare, as ovens were not yet common, and roasting grain on hot stones was labor-intensive. Meat was eaten sparingly, often reserved for special gatherings or religious offerings. The rest of the year, they relied on legumes like lentils and chickpeas, wild greens gathered from the hillsides, and the occasional fish from the Tiber. Water was fetched by hand, often in clay jars, balanced on shoulders or carried with simple yokes. The river was not always safe to drink directly. Its banks were shared with animals, and its water sometimes ran cloudy with mud after rains. People learned to scoop water from calmer spots, letting the sediment settle before using it. Some stored rainwater in small pits lined with clay, though this required careful covering to keep out insects. Trade was not yet the organized network that Rome would later command. Instead, exchange was local and practical. A jar of goat milk for a basket of figs, a length of woolen cloth for a polished bronze knife. Bronze itself was valuable, often reused and reforged. Metalworkers were rare, their skill learned through long apprenticeship, and their work prized as much for its utility as for any decoration. The people here were not isolated. Across the hills and along the Tiber's banks were other small communities, each with its own customs and leaders. Paths through the forest and across the plains linked These settlements, though road was too generous a word, these were trampled footways, muddy in winter and dusty in summer, with ruts where carts had passed. Tira was slow, and visitors brought not only goods, but news, a birth, a death, a rumor of strangers from beyond the mountains. Religious life centered on the seasons and the unseen forces thought to govern them. Every planting, every harvest, every birth and death was marked with small offerings, a handful of grain cast into the fire, a libation of milk poured on the ground, a ribbon tied to a tree thought to shelter a spirit. These acts were not yet organized into the complex rituals of later Rome. They were personal and local, born from the daily uncertainty of survival. The Tiber's floods were both feared and welcomed, could sweep away huts and drown fields, but they also left behind rich, dark silt that made the land fertile. Over time, families learned to build in places where the floods would not reach, while still farming the lowlands when the waters receded. These seasonal rhythms became part of life's pattern: plant, harvest, rebuild, prepare for the next. Change. We know little of their individual names, but their lives left quiet traces, shards of pottery buried in soil, post holes where huts once stood, ash from countless fires. Archaeology fills in some details, but much remains guesswork, built from patterns and comparisons. What is certain is that these small, scattered communities were laying the groundwork, unwittingly, for something far larger than themselves. In here, the stillness of these early centuries, before kings or senators or legions, one must wonder, how did a few clusters of mud huts on the hills above a river become the seed of an empire that would shape the world? By the time the 8th century BCE was giving way to the 7th, the Tiber's hills were no longer isolated islands of habitation. The slopes that had once held only scattered family huts now carried the beginnings of organized clusters, the first signs of what archaeologists call proto-urban life. It was not yet Rome, not yet even a single village, but a constellation of small communities, each bound to its own hill, each with its own elders, customs, and boundaries. The 7 hills of early Rome, the Palatine, Capitoline, Aventine, Salient, Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal, were not equally suited for settlement. The Palatine, rising gently above the river, offered a defensible position in fertile lowlands nearby. The Capitoline was steeper, its rocky slopes providing a natural barrier. Others, like the Esquiline, were broader, allowing more space for dwellings and fields. Families tended to choose their hill for practical reasons, where the soil was best, where water was accessible, where the wind offered some relief from summer heat. Over time, trails deepened into well-worn paths between these hills. At first, they were used for trading goods, extra grain carried to neighbors in exchange for salt, firewood traded for wool. But something else was happening. People were talking more. Stories traveled as quickly as goods, and gradually, so did ideas. A technique for building more stable walls with layered mud and straw might be adopted from one hill to the next. Belief in a particular protective spirit could spread, reshaping how people planted crops or buried their dead. As connections grew, certain gatherings became regular. The low valley between the Palatine and the Capitoline, a place that would one day be known as the Roman Forum, began to serve as a neutral meeting ground. It was not yet the stone-paved political center we imagine. In these early years, it was little more than a damp clearing, prone to flooding. But here, people could exchange surplus grain, find a craftsman to repair a broken plow, or arrange marriages that linked one hill's families to another. These gatherings were slow to develop, but once they became part of the yearly rhythm, they created something new. The habit of acting as a larger community with closer ties came the need for agreements. Disputes over pasture land, water access, or grazing routes had to be settled. And in the absence of written laws, settlements relied on the authority of respected elders. These men, chosen for their age, their wisdom, or sometimes simply their ability to speak well, began to serve as informal judges. Their role was not codified, but it set a precedent that the community, not just the family, could have a say in resolving problems. The physical look of the settlements was also beginning to change. While individual huts still dotted the slopes, more permanent structures were appearing. Storage pits lined with clay were dug to keep grains safe from moisture and pests. Some families began building rectangular houses with sturdier frameworks, their walls strengthened with woven wattle, plastered more thickly with mud. Roofs were still thatched, but better tied against storms. And slowly, the central hearth in each home was joined by smaller fire pits used for cooking outside. Especially in summer, cultural influences were filtering in from beyond the hills. To the north, the Etruscans were already more advanced in engineering, metalwork, and religious organization. To the south, Greek colonies in Italy brought pottery styles, new crops like the olive, and ideas about civic organization. Traders moving along the river or across the land brought not just goods, but glimpses of more complex societies. Even if the hill dwellers did not fully understand these foreign customs, they could see their benefits: more durable tools, better storage jars, new building methods. Religious life was adapting as well. Small shrines began to appear at crossroads, dedicated to household gods or protective spirits. Seasonal festivals were no longer purely domestic affairs. Some now involved gatherings of multiple families from different hills, offering sacrifices to ensure good harvests or protection from disease. The act of worshiping together, standing before the same fire, sharing the same food afterward, helped cement the idea that they belonged to something larger than themselves. The Tiber, ever unpredictable, continued to shape life. Floods remained a danger, but the knowledge of where to build and how to store goods in higher ground grew more sophisticated. In dry months, the river was a source of clay for pottery and mud for construction. Fishermen learned the patterns of the fish, casting nets in certain places during certain seasons. Children learned to wade into the shallows under the watch of elders, filling for mussels or scooping small fish into baskets. With all of these developments, settlements were beginning to act more like a single organism. Still, the idea of a city was far away, and perhaps even unimaginable. These were people used to thinking in terms of their hill, their family, their nearest neighbors. But changes were gathering like clouds. The first defensive ditches were being dug in some lowlands, and stories spoke of the need to prepare for times when the hills would have to defend themselves together. One must pause here, in this moment, before Rome truly exists, and consider, was this slow weaving of community the result of deliberate vision, or simply the inevitable outcome of living close enough that one could no longer ignore the neighbors? By the middle of the 8th century BCE, the scattered hilltop villages along the Tiber were no longer just neighbors. They were becoming something new, something more than the sum of their parts. Paths between hills had widened into well-used tracks. Meeting spaces in the valleys had become familiar gathering points, and the rhythm of life was increasingly coordinated between communities. In this slow, almost unnoticed transformation, the earliest city of Rome was beginning to emerge. The Palatine Hill, with its commanding position over the river and its fertile surroundings, had already become the favored site for leadership. Here, huts began to cluster more densely, forming the core of what some later historians would call the first urbs. These were not stone houses or marble temples. It was still simple dwellings, but their closeness created a sense of permanence and shared identity. Families from the smaller hills began moving toward this hub, especially those seeking better access to trade or protection. The need for defense was growing. Raids from neighboring tribes were not constant, but they were dangerous enough to shape thinking. Around some hills, shallow ditches were dug and earthen ramparts piled high. wooden palisades were erected in vulnerable spots. While such defenses could not stop a determined attack, they acted as a warning system, giving the community time to gather and respond. The very act of building them together reinforced the idea that survival depended on collective action. It was during this period that shared leadership began to take on a more formal shape. Instead of elders resolving disputes only within their own hill community, representatives from multiple hills began meeting to discuss matters affecting all. These early councils were not yet a government in the later Roman sense, but they served as a foundation. Out of these gatherings, certain individuals gained influence, men who could negotiate peace, arrange alliances, or decide when to prepare for defense. Over time, one figure might be recognized as holding greater authority, a role that would eventually become the kingship of early Rome. Religion played a crucial role in this unification. Festivals honoring common gods drew people from across the hills. Sacrifices, feasts, and processions were not merely acts of devotion. They were occasions to reaffirm shared customs and strengthen bonds. The open spaces that hosted these events, dry patches of ground in what would one day be the forum, became natural centers for decision-making. Here, religious and political life began to intertwine, foreshadowing the inseparable relationship between faith and governance in Rome's future. The merging of the hills also meant merging resources. The construction of the Cloaca Maxima, one of the earliest known drainage systems, is often credited to a slightly later period. But its origins likely lay in these early communal efforts to make low-lying areas usable. Clearing marshland and channeling water allowed for more building space in the valleys and reduced the constant problem of flooding. Such large-scale projects required more labor than any single hill could supply, proving that cooperation brought tangible benefits. Trade became more organized. Instead of relying only on informal bartering, certain days of the month were set aside for market gatherings. Goods from beyond the Tiber Valley, salt from the coast, fine pottery from the Etruscans, small quantities of imported bronze began to appear. These items were rare and expensive, but their presence was a sign that the new settlement was becoming part of wider trade networks. The Tiber's role as a transport route was increasingly important, allowing goods to move more easily than by land alone. Everyday life, though still humble, was becoming more complex. Craftsmen specializing in pottery, weaving, or metalwork could now make a living without farming full-time, supported by the larger community. Young men trained not only in tending herds, but in carrying spears and using shields, as defense was now seen as a duty shared by all. Women's roles extended beyond household work. They managed stalls at markets, prepared offerings for communal rituals, and passed down oral traditions that linked families across hills. Language, too, was evolving. The Latin spoken by these early people was enriched by words from neighboring tribes and traders. Common terms for tools, crops, and building methods spread quickly, helping to unify speech across the settlement. A shared language made cooperation easier and reduced misunderstandings in trade and agreements. By the late 8th century BCE, outsiders were beginning to recognize this place not as a collection of villages, but as a singular community. The process had been gradual, without a single moment of founding. There was no grand declaration, no instant transformation, only the steady knitting together of lives, customs, and needs. Yet in that slow merging, something remarkable had happened. A city had been born. And so, standing at the threshold of recorded history, one must ask, in a world of countless small settlements, why was it this one, these 7 hills by the Tiber, that would endure, grow, and one day command an empire? Asterisk, the city that would one day stretch across continents began on a landscape shaped not by human hands, but by time, water, and stone. The 7 hills, Palatine, Capitoline, Aventine, Celian, Esquiline, Viminal, and Querinal rose gently from the surrounding plains, not like jagged mountain peaks, but as rounded, weathered guardians above the bends of the Tiber River, long before the Romans built walls and towers. These hills were their first defense, a natural geography, that made it harder for enemies to approach unseen. The Palatine Hill was the heart of early Rome. Its slopes were gentle enough to farm, but high enough to avoid the floods that regularly swept the valley. Archaeologists have found post holes and pottery fragments here dating back to the 10th century BCE, long before the unification of the hills. The people who settled here could look down over the river crossings, shallow spots where herders could move cattle or traders could pass with their goods. Controlling such a crossing was as valuable as any wall to the northwest. The Capitoline Hill was different, steeper, rockier, and harder to climb. Later, it would host temples and political buildings. But in these early years, it was a lookout post, a place where watchfires could warn of approaching danger. The hill's height gave a clear view across the river to the west, where Etruscan lands lay, and to the north, where trade routes threaded through the hills. The Aventine Hill, farther south, was more isolated, separated from the Palatine by a stretch of low ground. Its fertile slopes attracted farmers, and its position near the river made it a good site for trade. In time, it would be associated with the common people, but in the earliest days, it was simply another valuable piece of land to watch over crops and control movement along the river. The Celian Hill was more heavily wooded than the others, providing timber for building and firewood for the growing settlements. The Esquiline, Viminal, and Querinal hills formed the northeastern edge of the inhabited area. They were less steep, but their broad tops provided space for more dwellings as the population grew. These outer hills were the first to feel the approach of anyone coming from the plains beyond. The valleys between these hills were both a blessing and a burden. They held fertile soil for crops, but also collected water during heavy rains, turning to mud and marsh. In the early years, these lowlands were avoided for building, but their open spaces made them natural meeting grounds. Over time, as drainage improved, these valleys would become the sites of markets, assemblies, and religious gatherings, bones upon which the city's public life would grow. The idea of fortifying the hills came slowly. At first, their height and separation were enough, but as trade expanded and strangers appeared more often on the horizon, the need for man-made defenses became clear. Early fortifications were not the stone walls we think of today. They were shallow ditches cut along the slopes, earthen embankments topped with wooden stakes, and simple gates that could be closed at night. These barriers were meant to slow attackers, not stop them outright. Their true value lay in giving defenders time to prepare. Building such defenses required cooperation. A single hill could raise its own palisade, but to link the hills together, workers had to coordinate digging ditches and placing watch points at strategic gaps. The process of deciding where and how to build these defenses forced the early communities to act as one. In doing so, they were not just protecting themselves from enemies. They were laying the groundwork for a shared identity. Daily life continued alongside this gradual militarization. Farmers tended to their fields on the lower slopes. Herders grazed animals on the edges of the hills, and traders moved goods between communities. But now there was a new awareness. Safety was not guaranteed by geography alone. The hills were strong, but they could not see everything. To survive, the people would have to watch the land as carefully as the land had watched over them. In the quiet of those early mornings, when mist clung to the Tiber and the hills rose like islands in a sea of fog, one question must have lingered in the minds of those who stood watch. How long could these hills alone keep danger at bay? And when would the city need something more? By the time the scattered settlements of the 7 hills were beginning to think of themselves as one community, the world beyond was pressing in. The Tiber was not just a life-giving river, it was a road for merchants, wanderers, and sometimes those who came with less peaceful intentions. Raiders from the Apennine foothills, opportunistic bands from the coastal plains, and ambitious Etruscan leaders all understood the value of the river crossing near the Palatine. It was only a matter of time before the hills would need more than their natural slopes to stay safe. The earliest attempts at serious fortification were modest. Colortuckle traces suggest that in certain spots, especially at the lower approaches to the Palatine and Capitoline, shallow defensive ditches, or fossae, were dug. The soil removed from these ditches was piled into embankments, aggers, which were then topped with sharpened stakes. These were not impenetrable walls. They were deterrents, meant to slow attackers long enough for defenders to gather. Represented something more important: cooperation between hills. Building a continuous line of defense across multiple hills was no small task. Laborers had to be fed, tools provided, and work coordinated. Clearing brush, digging earth, cutting timber, and setting stakes took weeks of effort. In a community where most people's time was needed for farming or herding, such projects could only happen when the need was felt by all. That they were undertaken at all tells us that a shared sense of danger and shared responsibility had taken root. The first large-scale unifying fortification project seems to have been the protection of the Palatine-Capitoline corridor. This was the heart of the settlement, the link between the earliest religious gathering places and the emerging political spaces. Defending this core meant defending the city's identity. Watch points were placed at higher spots along the embankments, where lookouts could see smoke or dust from approaching groups. Long before they reached the walls, not all dangers came from war bands. The river itself could turn against the settlement, flooding low ground and washing away crops. Fortification, in the early Roman mind, did not mean only walls against men. It also meant efforts to manage the land. Channels were dug to divert water, and in some cases, low retaining structures were built to keep soil from sliding away during storms. The skills learned in these flood control efforts would later be applied to more complex construction, like the Cloaca Maxima. Trade and defense were tightly linked. The people of the hills knew that without secure borders, merchants would avoid them. And without merchants, the goods and ideas that gave them an edge over their neighbors would stop flowing. This practical awareness likely drove the earliest decisions to place gates where roads entered the fortified zone. These gates were simple, heavy wooden panels bound with leather or bronze fittings, but they symbolized a new power: the ability to decide who entered and who did not. The building process itself changed the way people saw their city. Who dug the ditches and lifted the stakes could look out over the work they had done together and feel that the settlement was theirs in a new way. It was no longer just the Palatine's people or the Aventine's people. It was their defended ground. This sense of shared space would later be one of Rome's greatest strengths, allowing it to absorb newcomers and allies without losing its core identity. Defensive rituals grew alongside the physical works. Before new sections of wall or embankment were begun, small offerings might be made to local gods, perhaps a libation poured into the earth, or the first timber post anointed with oil. These acts were as much about social cohesion as belief. To build together, one had to believe in the same purpose. Ritual reinforced that purpose. By the end of this phase, the 7 hills were no longer isolated clusters that merely knew of each other. They were becoming a city whose boundaries could be walked in a single circuit, a city whose people felt secure enough to trade more, farm more, and even venture beyond their immediate surroundings. Yet, even as the first lines of defense were completed, a quiet understanding lingered. Walls can be built higher, ditches dug deeper, but what happens when the danger comes from within? The first serious test of the early fortifications did not come as a single great siege, but as a series of smaller pressures that exposed their strengths and their limits. The people of the Seven Hills had built ditches, embankments, and gates to keep danger at a distance. But the challenges they faced in the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE were as much about human decision-making as they were about physical barriers. The earliest recorded threats were raids, small, fast-moving groups from neighboring tribes. These attacks were not aimed at conquering the hills, but at taking livestock, grain, or other valuables before slipping away. In such cases, the walls and gates were less about stopping entry entirely and more about buying time. Watchmen stationed on the Capitol line or Palatine could shout warnings, and the people would rush animals inside enclosures, bar gates, and prepare to defend narrow approaches. In this sense, the fortifications worked. The raiders rarely got past the first barriers before deciding the effort wasn't worth the risk. But defense required more than walls. It required coordination, and that meant leadership. As the fortified zones linked the hills, so too did the need for a common response link their leaders. Early councils, once concerned mostly with trade and seasonal festivals, now discussed matters of patrols, gatekeeping, and resource pooling. It is likely in this period that the role of a single, decisive war leader began to emerge, the forerunner of the Roman kingship. Such a figure could organize a response more quickly than a council could debate one. External threats weren't the only challenges. Disputes sometimes broke out between hills over who was responsible for repairing certain sections of wall, or who had rights to the land just outside the fortifications. These disagreements could slow repairs, leaving gaps or weak spots. Here, the early city learned an important truth. Fortifications are only as strong as the unity of the people behind them. The influence of the Etruscans to the north also grew in this period. Their cities had more sophisticated walls and gates, often made from cut stone rather than earth and timber. Contact with these neighbors, whether through trade, alliance, or skirmish, exposed the people of the Seven Hills to new building techniques. In some places, timber palisades were replaced or reinforced with stone footings, creating stronger and longer-lasting defenses. The idea of a continuous encircling wall, the murus, began to take hold, though it would be centuries before it reached its monumental later form. Meanwhile, life inside the fortifications took on a new rhythm. Markets could now operate with a greater sense of safety, attracting traders from further away. Workshops for pottery, weaving, and metalwork clustered near the gates, ready to serve both locals and visitors. But security also brought responsibilities. Gatekeepers had to be vigilant, courting who came and went, and ensuring that merchants did not smuggle weapons inside. Religious practice adapted to the fortified city as well. Certain gates were associated with protective deities, and small shrines were built nearby. Offerings might be made when the gates were closed at night or opened at dawn, symbolically asking the gods to watch over the city's thresholds. The connection between physical safety and spiritual favor became part of the daily life of the early Romans. Still, the fortifications had their limitations. They could keep out sudden raids, but they were less effective against prolonged threats like blockades. If an enemy camped nearby and cut off access to farmland and trade routes, the city would have to rely on stored grain and preserved goods. Such situations tested the discipline of the people inside the walls, for hunger could stir unrest as easily as fear by the close of this era. The Seven Hills stood not just as a natural formation, but as a defended community, one that had learned to think beyond the needs of individual families or hills. The walls and ditches were proof of what could be achieved together, but they also posed a quiet question that lingered in the minds of those who patrolled their length. In the centuries to come, would Rome's strength lie in the height of its walls, or in the unity of the people behind them? Asterisk. The birth of Rome is told, most famously, through a story that mixes memory, symbolism, and the kind of embellishment that passes eerily from mouth to ear over centuries. It begins not with walls or councils, but with two abandoned infants beside the slow, shifting waters of the Tiber. Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers, whose names are forever tied to Rome's beginning, occupy a space between myth and history. Their story echoing older traditions, yet rooted in places we can still walk today. The earliest versions of the tale describe how the twins were the grandsons of a dethroned king from the nearby city of Alba Longa. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was forced into the role of a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to chastity, in an attempt to prevent her from bearing any heirs who might claim power. Yet, according to the legend, she bore twin sons, their father said to be the god Mars. The birth of the boys was not celebrated. It was seen as a threat. An order was given for them to be drowned in the Tiber. The story pauses here, on the muddy banks of the river. We can imagine, not as a dramatic scene, but as a quiet one, a small wicker basket set adrift, carried along by the current past reeds and willow trees. The river's course was unpredictable, and according to the myth, it ran high that year, flooding its banks. The basket came to rest at the base of the Palatine Hill, near a wild fig tree. It is here that the most enduring image of the legend appears. A she-wolf, drawn by the cries of the infants, descended to the riverbank. Instead of harming them, she nursed them, her milk sustaining them until they were found by a shepherd named Faustulus. The shepherd and his wife, Aclarentia, raised the boys as their own, unaware, or perhaps only pretending to be unaware, of their royal blood. From a historical standpoint, archaeologists treat this story with caution. The survival of abandoned infants is not unprecedented, but the details, divine parentage, wolf nurse, belong more to the realm of symbolic storytelling. Wolves were both feared and respected in ancient Italy. In some cultures, they represented fierce guardianship. The image of the she-wolf could have been a metaphor for the protective spirit of the land, or for the harsh, dangerous environment that nevertheless sustained life. As the boys grew, the legend tells us they became leaders among the shepherds and hunters of the surrounding hills, skilled in tracking, hunting, and organizing defense against wild animals and raiders. They were respected for their strength and decisiveness. Eventually, their true identity was revealed, and they returned to Alba Longa to depose the usurper who had taken their grandfather's throne. It is at this point in the myth that history and legend entwine most tightly, whether or not Romulus and Remus existed as individuals. The tale reflects a broader truth. The earliest Romans saw themselves as people of mixed origins, shepherds, warriors, and outcasts drawn together. Rather than the descendants of a single, unbroken line, the story gave them a shared identity, one that emphasized resilience, cunning, and the ability to survive in a harsh landscape. After restoring their grandfather's place, the twins chose not to remain in Alba Longa. Instead, they returned to the hills above the Tiber, drawn to the site where they had been saved. Here, they decided they would build a new settlement. But the story leaves us here at a moment of choice without yet telling us what that decision would cost, or how it would shape the very first days of Rome. And so, the question lingers, if the twins had chosen a different place, far from the Tiber and the Seven Hills, would Rome ever have come into being at all? Asterisk, when Romulus and Remus returned to the place of their rescue along the Tiber, the hills and valleys were still largely as they had been in their childhood: scattered huts, grazing animals, patches of cultivated land. Yet now, as young men with followers, they saw the place differently. This was no longer just a familiar stretch of riverbank. It was a site with the potential to be a new center of life, a place to gather people under their leadership. The legend tells us that the brothers agreed to found a settlement here, but they could not agree on which hill should hold it. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, closer to the river crossing and more defensible. Remus preferred the Aventine with its broader slopes and open views. In a time without written contracts or binding laws, disputes of this kind were often settled through signs, omens believed to reveal the will of the gods. The method chosen was augury, the observation of birds in flight. Each brother took position on his chosen hill, scanning the sky for the first sign. Remus claimed to see 6 vultures. Romulus claimed to see 12. Whether the numbers were counted truthfully or adjusted to favor their own cause, the outcome was clear. Both felt the gods had favored them. The disagreement escalated, and in the heat of the dispute, Remus mocked his brother's new walls by leaping over them in retaliation or in defense of the sanctity of his construction. Romulus struck him down in the myth. This act is presented as the tragic but decisive moment in Rome's founding. Romulus, now sole leader, declared the new city's name, Roma, in his own honor. The wall he had been building on the Palatine would mark the first boundary of the settlement, while the legend emphasizes fraternal rivalry. The underlying message was one Romans would carry into their history. The city's survival was worth any sacrifice, even the most personal. From a historical perspective, this story of a single founder's act of violence may reflect real tensions in early community formation. Archaeological evidence shows that the Palatine was indeed the site of one of the earliest substantial settlements, with post holes and hearth remains dating to the mid-5th century BCE, roughly the period assigned to Romulus by later historians. The idea of a single wall may be symbolic, but the importance of defining boundaries was very real. In a world of shifting alliances and vulnerable outposts, a marked perimeter was the difference between being recognized as a community and being dismissed as a temporary camp. The act of founding a city was more than physical labor. It was a religious and cultural statement. In early Roman tradition, the founder would plow a furrow around the chosen site, marking the pomerium, the sacred boundary. This was not just a line in the soil. It was a spiritual perimeter, one that could not be crossed without permission. Temples, altars, and public spaces would be oriented according to this sacred geography. By setting the pomerium, Romulus was not only claiming land, but creating a space with divine sanction. The death of Remus in the legend serves another purpose. It underlines the idea that Rome's unity could only come from the resolution of internal conflict. While modern historians see the story as myth, it reflects a reality common to early settlements. Disputes over leadership and land could quickly turn violent. Survival required clear authority, and in this case, the myth leaves no ambiguity about who would hold it. Once Romulus was acknowledged as the sole founder, the city's early organization could begin. The myth credits him with creating the first divisions of the population into tribes and curae and establishing religious rights to protect the city's future. Whether or not these acts were his alone, they point to a truth about early Rome. It was a community that sought order from its very first day. Yet, the story leaves us here with another question. One not about walls or kingship, but about the people themselves. What kind of men and women chose to leave their hills and join this new city, binding their fate to a settlement that, at the time, was little more than a name, a wall, and a hope? In the version of the legend told by later Roman historians, Romulus did not inherit a thriving population when he stood as the sole founder of the new city. The walls were built, the sacred boundary marked, but a city is more than empty space. It is people. And here, myth offers an explanation that blends necessity with invention. Rome became a haven for those who had nowhere else to go. According to tradition, Romulus opened what was called an asylum on the Capitoline Hill. This was not an asylum in the modern sense, but a designated place where fugitives could find protection. It was open to men from neighboring communities, whether they had fled debt, exile, or trouble with the law. Gate slaves, wanderers without kin, and men accused of crimes all found a place here. The earliest Romans, then, were not a single tribe or clan. They were a gathering of outcasts to the Romans, telling the story centuries later. This origin was not shameful. It was a point of pride. Rome's strength, they argued, came from its ability to absorb outsiders and turn them into citizens. This mixed beginning set it apart from other cities that guarded their bloodlines and traditions more jealously. A twist. From the start, Rome's survival depended not on purity, but on expansion of population, alliances, of opportunity. Archaeology provides a quieter but complementary picture. Excavations on the Palatine and nearby hills reveal evidence of huts from multiple periods and styles, suggesting that the early population may indeed have been a mix of groups. Variations in pottery types and burial practices point to different cultural origins among the settlers. The physical remains mirrored the legend's idea of a city built by many hands and many backgrounds. Still, it was a problem. The new city had plenty of men, but few women. Without families, the settlement could not grow naturally. Here, the legend turns to one of the most controversial episodes in Rome's early mythology, the rape of the Sabine women. In the story, Romulus invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival, offering hospitality and entertainment. At a signal, the Romans seized the Sabine women and drove off their male relatives. The women were not taken as slaves, the legend insists, but as wives, with the promise of shared property and legal rights. In time, the Sabine families were reconciled to the union, and the two communities merged. Whether this episode has any historical basis is impossible to prove, but it again reflects a deeper truth about early Rome. Expansion often came through a combination of force and integration. Alliances were not always voluntary, but once made, they were absorbed into the fabric of the city. The result was a population that grew quickly, bound together not by common ancestry, but by shared interest in the survival and prosperity of the whole dot. As the population expanded, so did the need for structure. Romulus is credited with creating the first Roman legions, not yet the disciplined armies of later centuries, but organized groups of fighting men who could be called upon to defend the city or raid neighboring territories. He also established a council of elders, the Senate, composed of the most respected heads of families. This body advised the king and played a role in major decisions, setting the pattern for Rome's political life. Religious life developed alongside these political structures. Shrines to Jupiter, Mars, and Vesta began to appear in the cities. Calendars started to take shape around festivals tied to planting, harvest, and military campaigning. These rituals helped unify a population that came from different traditions, giving them common practices and shared stories. By the time Romulus's reign ended, the legend says he vanished in a storm and was taken up among the gods. The city was no longer just a defended settlement on the Palatine. It was a functioning society with laws, leadership, and a population drawn from many corners of the Italian peninsula. Whether the man himself was real or a composite of many leaders, the Rome he is said to have founded was already different from its neighbors, larger, more open, and more willing to reshape itself with each new addition. And yet, one question remains as we leave the age of myth and step further into history. Was Rome's strength truly born from its openness? Or did that openness simply mask the divisions that would one day test the unity of the Seven Hills? Asterisk, by the early 7th century BCE, Rome was no longer an isolated hilltop community. Its walls were defined, its population was growing, and its markets hummed with the slow rhythm of trade. But beyond the northern horizon, across the Tiber and over the low ridges, lay a people whose influence would soon seep into every part of Roman life. The Etruscans. The Etruscans were not a single city, but a network of independent city-states, spread across what the Romans called Etruria, a region of fertile hills and valleys stretching from the Arno River in the north to the Tiber in the south. Their towns were larger, their temples grander, and their artisans more skilled than anything Rome had yet seen. They worked bronze and iron with precision, carved stone into lasting monuments, and decorated their tombs with scenes of banquets, dancing, and games. Rome's first contact with the Etruscans likely came through trade. The Tiber was a natural link between the coast and the inland valleys, and goods moved along it in both directions. From the north came fine pottery, metal, tools, and ornaments, bracelets of worked bronze, pins of ivory, and richly painted vessels. In return, Rome could offer agricultural products, salt from the marshes, and access to the river crossing at the foot of the Palatine. Trade was not the only thing that crossed the river. Ideas traveled to ways of building, governing, and worshiping. The Etruscans had already learned from contact with the Greeks to the south, and they brought with them architectural techniques like the true arch and the use of stone for large-scale construction. To a people still accustomed to Madanda's huts, these methods must have seemed a glimpse into another world. Cultural exchange did not happen evenly. Some Roman families embraced Etruscan styles of dress, tunics fastened with bronze fibulae, patterned cloths draped over the shoulder, while others held to older, simpler ways. Religious practices also shifted. Etruscans were masters of divination, reading omens from the flight of birds. The patterns in lightning were the entrails of sacrificed animals. Rome already had traditions of augury, but Etruscan methods added new layers of formality and symbolism, influencing rituals that would persist for centuries. Politically, the relationship was more complex. The Etruscans were not a single empire, but they could act in concert when interests aligned. Some of their cities, Veii, Tarquini, Cara, were close enough to Rome to see it as both a trading partner and a potential rival. Alliances could shift quickly. One year, Rome might host Etruscan merchants in its markets, but might face Etruscan warriors across a battlefield. Archaeology suggests that by this period, Rome itself was beginning to adopt Etruscan building practices. Timber frames were replaced in some structures by stone foundations. Roofs were tiled with terracotta, giving a more permanent look to important buildings. Drainage projects improved the usability of the low-lying areas, turning marshy ground into public space. The first versions of the Forum, still simple by later standards, began to emerge in this time. The Etruscans also brought a vision of kingship that would leave a deep mark on Rome. Their rulers were not merely military leaders. They were ceremonial figures, wearing richly embroidered robes and holding the fasces bundles of rods, sometimes with an axe, as symbols of authority. Later, Roman kings would adopt similar regalia, and even after the monarchy was gone, the fasces would remain as a sign of state power. Yet, for all their influence, Etruscans remained in Roman eyes outsiders. Their language was unlike Latin, their burial customs unfamiliar, and their art often depicted scenes of luxury that contrasted with the harder, more restrained image Romans preferred for themselves. This mixture of admiration and suspicion would define the relationship for generations. Here, at the edge of this first period of contact, one cannot help but wonder, was Rome shaping itself in the image of the Etruscans, or was it quietly preparing to outgrow and eventually surpass them? Asterisk, by the middle of the 7th century BCE, Etruscan influence on Rome was no longer confined to traded goods or borrowed building methods. It had taken human form in the figure of Rome's kings. Its tradition holds that several of Rome's early monarchs were of Etruscan origin, and whether every detail is true or not, the archaeological record supports the idea that this was a period of sudden, organized development. The Rome of simple huts and scattered shrines was giving way to a city of planned spaces, public works, and ceremonial power. The most famous of these rulers was Tarquinius Priscus, Tarquin the Elder. According to later Roman accounts, He was born in the Etruscan city of Tarquini, the son of a Greek immigrant father and an Etruscan mother. Ambitious and skilled in statecraft, he left his native city for Rome, where he gained the favor of King Ancus Marcius upon the king's death. Tarquin was chosen as his successor, marking a shift from purely Latin leadership to one with clear northern ties. Under Tarquin's reign, the city began projects on a scale it had never seen before. The marshy lowland between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, long a seasonal hazard, strained through the early stages of what would become the Cloaca Maxima, a massive sewer that channeled water into the Tiber. This was more than sanitation. It turned swamp into solid ground, making space for a true civic center. Markets, assemblies, and religious ceremonies could now be held in what was becoming the Forum. Tarquin also brought Etruscan style to public ceremony, expanded religious festivals, introducing chariot racing and public games in the fashion of Etruria. The Circus Maximus, in its earliest form, was laid out during his reign, not yet the stone colossus of later centuries, but a long, open track where horses thundered and spectators gathered on wooden stands. These events were more than entertainment. They reinforced the king's role as the giver of public joy and prosperity. Architecture, too, bore the Etruscan stamp. Temples were constructed with raised podiums, wide front steps, and deep porches, a style distinct from the low, rectangular shrines of earlier Rome. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, begun in this era, would become a centerpiece of Roman religion for centuries. Its terracotta decorations and grand scale were unmistakably Etruscan in origin. Military organization advanced as well. The Etruscans had a tradition of well-equipped infantry supported by skilled cavalry. Rome's army began adopting more standardized equipment, including helmets and body armor of bronze, and organizing troops into more formal units. The king was not only a religious and political leader, but the supreme commander in war. A model Rome had not invented, but adapted to its own needs. With these changes came a new visual language of power. The fasces, carried by the kings. Attendants symbolized authority, to punish and to protect. The purple-trimmed toga, the toga praetexta, became the garment of high office. These symbols, imported from Etruscan practice, would survive long after the monarchy itself was overthrown. Yet, the Etruscan kings also deepened tensions within Rome. The more the city adopted their customs, the more some Romans feared losing their own identity. Wealth and monumental building projects required resources, and those resources came from taxes, labor obligations, and the spoils of war. For the common people, the splendor of temples and games might be impressive, but it also meant heavier burdens. By the end of Tarquin the Elder's reign, Rome was no longer the modest hilltop settlement it had been a generation earlier. It was beginning to look and act like the great Etruscan cities to the north, planned, organized, and ambitious. But this transformation raised an enduring question in the minds of the Romans themselves. Would these changes make Rome stronger? Or would they bind it too closely to the will of kings who were not truly their own? After the reign of Tarquinius. Priscus, Rome's Etruscan connection did not fade. It deepened. His successors, Servius, Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, would leave an imprint on the city, so enduring that even after the monarchy was gone, Romans continued to live in the civic and physical structures they had built. Servius Tullius, though his origins are uncertain, is remembered in tradition as the king who reorganized Rome from the ground up. His reforms reached into every household, reshaping the way the city thought about itself. Instead of organizing the population solely by kinship or tribe, he divided citizens by property and wealth into formal classes. This was more than a bureaucratic convenience. It decided who could serve in the army, how much equipment, they were expected to provide. Ken, how much influence they had in political assemblies to implement this system. Harvius ordered the first recorded census in Roman history. The counting of citizens, their households, and their assets was a step toward a more structured, state-controlled society. For the ordinary Roman, it meant being recognized not just as a member of a family or neighborhood, but as part of a citywide order with rights, obligations, and a place in the larger machinery of Rome. He also extended the city's reach. The Servian Wall, a massive fortification attributed to his reign, expanded the defended area beyond the original bounds of the Palatine and Capitoline. Whether this wall was entirely his work or a later reinforcement, it reflected a shift in scale. Rome was no longer a cluster of defended hills. It was a single, enclosed urban space with a sense of permanence. Tarquinius Superbus, the final king, brought the Etruscan influence to its most visible height and to its breaking point. His reign, according to tradition, was marked by grandeur and oppression. He completed the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill, the largest and most important religious building in early Rome. Its scale, decoration, and position above the city were statements not just of piety, but of power. But power in his hands was wielded harshly. The legend paints him as a ruler who bypassed the Senate, silenced opposition, and relied on fear to maintain control. Whether these accounts are exaggerated by later Republican historians is difficult to say, but it is clear that his reign ended in revolt. The spark, tradition claims, was a personal outrage, the assault of Lucretia, a noblewoman, by the king's son. But the fuel had been building for years in resentment toward the concentration of authority in Etruscan hands. When the monarchy fell, the Romans did not erase all that the Etruscans had given them. The walls, temples, sewers, and public spaces remained. The religious rites, the symbols of office, and the city's organization still bore the imprint of the North. But politically, the Romans turned away from kingship altogether, vowing never again to be ruled by one man. Yet, even in rejecting their Etruscan rulers, the Romans carried forward the structures those kings had built, both physical and institutional. The forum, the circus, the walls, organization of citizens, all of it continued into the Republic and beyond. And so, looking back from the safety of later centuries, the question lingers, was the fall of the kings a break from Etruscan influence, or did the Romans simply keep the parts they could not live without? Asterisk. The word king often stirs images of grand halls, golden crowns, and sweeping gestures of power. But in early Rome, especially in its formative centuries, kingship was far more a matter of routine than a spectacle. The first Roman kings, whether Latin or Etruscan by birth, did not spend their days solely planning conquests or presiding over elaborate feasts. Much of their time was consumed by work that, while necessary, was slow, repetitive, and often unremarkable. The king was, first and foremost, the city's chief organizer. Rome in these centuries was not the sprawling empire it would later become. It was a compact settlement of hills and valleys, connected by pathways, dotted with markets and shrines. But even at this small scale, keeping order required daily attention. Streets needed clearing after storms. Water channels had to be inspected for blockages. Public grain stores required oversight to prevent spoilage or theft. The king was expected to ensure these things happened, not always by his own hands, but through a chain of trusted assistants whose work he monitored. He was also the chief magistrate, hearing disputes that could not be settled by local elders. These might involve grazing rights between families on different hills, accusations of theft at the market, or questions about who had the right to draw water from a certain well. While some cases could be resolved quickly, others required long sessions of testimony, with the king listening patiently to conflicting accounts, trying to balance fairness with the need to keep peace between influential households. religious duties filled another portion of the day. The king was not merely a political leader. He was the city's highest priest. Every significant decision, from building a wall to declaring war, required consultation with the gods. This meant conducting rituals personally or overseeing them closely. He might rise before dawn to observe the flight of birds for omens, stand at an altar while a sacrificial animal was prepared, or recite prayers in a precise order dictated by tradition. These acts had to be performed flawlessly, for a mistake could mean repeating the entire ceremony, sometimes at considerable cost. Diplomacy was another constant responsibility, though it was less about formal treaties and more about maintaining personal relationships. Visiting envoys from neighboring towns needed to be welcomed, housed, and entertained, even if they were rivals. This meant arranging lodging, providing meals, and exchanging gifts, not always lavish, but carefully chosen to convey respect. The king had to ensure that no slight, real or perceived, damaged Rome's standing among its neighbors. Military matters, while often the most remembered in later accounts, were not a daily occupation in times of peace. The king might inspect weapon stores, review small drills, or hear reports from scouts, but these activities were intermittent. Campaigns were seasonal, dictated by weather and agricultural needs, and much of the year's preparation was logistical, making sure there was enough grain to feed soldiers, enough leather to repair harnesses, and enough goodwill among allies to call on their aid when needed. In quieter moments, the king might walk through the markets, speaking with merchants and craftsmen. These interactions were not just symbolic, they gave him a sense of the city's mood. Was trade brisk? Were there shortages of essential goods? Did the people grumble about taxes or praise recent improvements? Such observations, taken over months and years, shaped decisions as much as formal councils did. All of this routine made king less a figure of distant majesty and more a constant presence in the city's life. People saw him in the streets, at the temples, in the markets. They brought complaints to him directly, greeted him during festivals, and sometimes petitioned him for favors. His authority rested not only on sacred rites or military command, but on the steady, visible management of the community's day-to-day needs. And yet, for all this daily work, one must ask, was it the king's personal attention that kept early Rome stable, or was it the growing machinery of the city itself that made his rule possible? Asterisk, if the king was the face of authority in early Rome, the Senate was its steady voice. In the background, its body, far from the political theater it would later began as a council of elders, the heads of Rome's leading families, known as paters. They were not elected by popular vote, nor did they rotate in and out quickly. Their positions were based on lineage, wealth, and the respect they commanded within their kin groups. The Senate's role during the monarchy was advisory, but advisory in this period meant more than polite suggestion. No major policy, whether declaring war, concluding a treaty, or making significant changes to religious practice, was likely to succeed without the Senate's support. The king might propose, but the elders' acceptance was often the difference between a smooth enactment and quiet resistance from powerful families. Senate meetings were rarely rushed affairs. They began with formal greetings, offerings to the gods, and a recounting of the matter at hand. Discussions could stretch for hours, sometimes days, especially when a decision touched on land distribution, the rights of certain families, or the allocation of spoils from recent campaigns. Elders spoke in turn, their words measured not only for content, but for how they might be remembered. In a city where political memory was long, a poorly chosen statement could follow a man for decades. The king presided over these gatherings, not as a distant monarch, but as a participant, guiding discussion, clarifying points, engaging the room's sentiment. He needed the Senate's trust to maintain his own authority, and so he listened, even when he disagreed. At times, he might have to set aside his own plans in order to preserve unity, knowing that an alienated Senate could subtly undermine his rule by withholding cooperation in military or civic matters. Below the Senate, decision-making extended into smaller councils. The king relied on appointed officers to manage specific tasks, overseeing the markets, maintaining the city's defenses, managing public works like roads and drainage. These officials were often chosen from among trusted families, their loyalty secured by honor and obligation, while the king could issue commands directly. These intermediaries allowed the machinery of governance to move without his constant personal attention. Communication between these layers of authority, slow but deliberate. Messengers carried decisions across the hills, calling small assemblies of citizens to announce new rules or upcoming projects. Because Rome's population was still compact, such announcements could spread quickly, yet there was no written record for the common people to consult. Decisions lived in memory and oral repetition, making clarity in public speech essential. This oral nature of governance meant that ceremonies and gestures carried as much weight as words. A decision ratified by the Senate might be marked by a public sacrifice, a formal procession, or the placement of a symbolic object, a spear for war, a sheaf of grain for peace and prosperity in a public space. These symbols served as visible reminders in a society where not all could read, but all could remember an image. For the average citizen, the workings of the Senate were distant yet tangible in their effects. A ruling might change when and where markets could be held, how much grain could be stored privately, or which neighboring communities were deemed friend or foe. Even if the decision itself was debated far from their hearing, its impact could be felt in the rhythm of daily life. And so, day after day, the king and his council shaped Rome, not with sweeping proclamations, but with a slow accumulation of small, steady decisions. This was governance as a craft, repetitive, deliberate, and, at times, tedious. Yet, without it, the city's fragile unity could have unraveled quickly, which leads to an enduring question about this period. Was the stability of early Rome the product of wise kings? Or was it the patient, methodical work of the Senate that truly kept the city together? In early Rome, the king was never just a ruler seated in a chair of judgment. He was expected to be both the guardian of the city's sacred rights and its commander in the field. These two roles, religious leader and military chief, were not seen as separate. To the Romans of the monarchy, success in battle depended as much on the favor of the gods as on the skill of soldiers. And the king was the link between divine will and human action. Ceremonial duties began before the sun had risen. On days marked for significant decisions or military ventures, the king might climb to a vantage point, sometimes on the Capitoline, sometimes on the Palatine, to perform augury. Watching the patterns of bird flight was not a casual glance skyward. It required patient observation, noting the type, number, and direction of the birds, and interpreting what these meant for the day ahead. The results were shared publicly, for without a favorable omen, certain actions could not proceed. When war was contemplated, the religious dimension deepened. Rome's earliest traditions required that declarations of war be made according to precise rituals. The king, through appointed priests, known as fedials, would formally demand restitution from an offending city. If refused, a spear, often tipped with iron or hardened wood, would be cast into the enemy's territory, symbolically beginning the conflict. Only then could military preparations begin in earnest. Once in the field, the king was not an observer, but an active leader. He directed the positioning of troops, decided when to engage or withdraw, and oversaw the distribution of supplies. Early Roman armies were small by later standards, often composed of landowning citizens who provided their own equipment. The king had to ensure these men were armed, fed, and perhaps most importantly, convinced of the cause. Tizic speeches before battle combined practical orders with invocations of divine favor, reinforcing that the fight was sanctioned by the gods. Victories, whether large or small, carried their own ceremonial requirements. Returning warriors might enter the city in procession, with captured goods or livestock displayed for all to see. The king would lead sacrifices in gratitude, dedicating a portion of the spoils to the gods. These rituals were not mere formalities. They reinforced the idea that military success and religious observance were bound together, each validating the other, even in times of peace. The military aspect of kingship was visible. Inspections of weapons and armor were conducted at set intervals. Drill exercises, though limited in scale, kept men familiar with their equipment and formations. The king often oversaw the maintenance of roads and paths used for troop movement, knowing that mobility could be the deciding factor in a campaign. This blend of readiness and ceremony gave the army a constant presence in Roman life, even when no war was at hand. Balancing these dual responsibilities required careful attention. A king, too, focused on ritual, risked being seen as weak in defense. One too eager for war could be accused of neglecting the gods. The successful ruler managed both with steady competence, understanding that in the Roman mind, the favor of the divine and the strength of arms were inseparable foundations of the city's safety. By the end of each year, the rhythm of ceremonies, councils, and occasional campaigns left the king as both the city's most visible figure and its most heavily burdened. His power was great, but it was tied to constant action, a chain of duties that left little room for idleness. And so the question arises as we close this account of the early kings. Daily burdens. Did Rome's first rulers shape the city through their own will, or were they simply the living embodiment of the roles the city demanded from whoever sat on the throne? Long before the Forum became the bustling center of Roman life, it was an inconvenient patch of land, low, marshy, and seasonally flooded. In heavy rains, water from the surrounding hills pooled here, mixing with silt from the Tiber and runoff from the slopes. In the dry season, it baked into cracked mud, leaving behind stagnant puddles that bred insects. The ground was too wet for reliable building and too unstable for heavy structures. Yet, it lay in the very middle of the growing city, between the Palatine, Capitoline, Esquiline hills, land too central to waste. The Romans of the monarchy, influenced by Etruscan engineering, understood that controlling water was key to controlling land. The idea of draining the low ground was ambitious, but not unthinkable. Etruscan cities had already built channels and culverts to redirect rainwater and waste. Rome would take this knowledge and apply it on a larger scale, creating a structure that would serve not only its immediate purpose, but also endure for centuries, the Cloaca Maxima. The Great Drain. At first, the project began modestly open trenches, cut through the marsh, lined with stone where the water's force threatened to erode the sides. These channels carried runoff toward the Tiber, allowing parts of the valley to dry enough for temporary use. But open ditches were a partial solution. They silted up quickly, smelled in the heat, and could be dangerous to animals and children. The leap from ditches to a covered, permanent sewer was the work of planners who thought in terms of generations, not seasons. Construction required both vision and manpower. Teams of laborers, some citizens, others enslaved captives from recent campaigns, dug deep channels, shaping the floor to slope gently toward the river. Large blocks of stone, cut and transported from quarries outside the city, were set into place without mortar, relying on precise cutting and sheer weight to hold them. The vaulting technique, learned from Etruscan builders, allowed the channels to be roofed over, creating a tunnel strong enough to bear the weight of people and carts above. The work was slow and methodical. Each section had to be tested during rain to ensure the flow was sufficient. Workers labored in damp, cramped conditions, often knee-deep in mud, using wooden shovels, baskets, and iron picks. There was no romance in this task, only the steady repetition of digging, shaping, and setting stone. Yet, as each segment was completed, more of the Forum Valley became usable. Over time, the Cloaca Maxima grew into a network, its main channel fed by smaller drains from surrounding streets and buildings. It carried not just stormwater, but also the waste of the city, flushing it into the Tiber. While the concept of sanitation was understood differently than today, stunningly, the reduction of stagnant water and filth in the city's heart improved health and made the area far more attractive for public use. The impact was immediate in civic terms. With the marsh drained, the Forum could host markets more regularly, and religious gatherings no longer risked being disrupted by flooding. Temporary stalls gave way to more permanent structures. The open space became a shared point between hills, a neutral ground where political and social life could take shape. In later centuries, Roman historians would look back on the Cloaca Maxima as one of the monarchy's great achievements, a symbol of practical engineering and the will to improve the city's foundations. It was, in essence, an unglamorous project with glamorous results. By making undesirable land livable, it created the physical stage for the growth of Roman public life. And so, we pause on the edge of this transformation to consider, was the greatness of Rome built first in its temples and armies, or was it born in the quiet, muddy labor of those who turned the swamp into the city's heart? Asterisk. Once the first stretch of the Cloaca Maxima was completed, it became clear that this was not a one-time project, but the beginning of an ongoing system. The initial channel had drained the lowest, marshiest parts of the Forum Valley, but water still flowed down from the hills after heavy rain, carving small rivulets through streets and carrying silt back toward the center. To keep the ground dry, the Romans began extending the network. Secondary drains, smaller channels feeding into the main sewer, were dug from the slopes of the Palatine, Capitoline, and Esquiline hills. These were more modest in size, sometimes just covered stone-lined ditches, but their role was crucial. They collected runoff before it could pool in the low ground, directing it into the Great Tunnel. Over time, every significant street or open area near the Forum had its own drainage route, all converging into the main channel that ran toward the Tiber. The covered sections of the Cloaca were engineering achievements in themselves. The Etruscan technique of corbel vaulting gave way in some places to a true arch, a design that distributed weight evenly and allowed for larger spans without collapse. Stonecutters shaped heavy twofold blocks with precision, fitting them together so tightly that even centuries later, many joints would remain nearly watertight. There was no cement in these early builds. The stability came entirely from the skill of the builders and the mass of the materials. Maintaining the sewer became as important as building it. Silt, debris, and even fallen branches from storms could block the flow. Workers periodically entered the covered channels, clearing obstructions with poles and baskets. This was unpleasant work, dark, damp, and foul-smelling, but without it, the benefits of the entire system could be undone in a single flood. The maintenance itself was a reminder that great works did not stay great without constant human effort. The social effect of the Cloaca Maxima was felt quickly. The Forum's open ground became more predictable in its condition. Merchants could set up stalls without fear that a sudden rain would turn the market into a mud pit. Religious ceremonies, especially those tied to seasonal festivals, could proceed without interruption. The idea of a central place where all hills could gather was no longer limited by the weather, and that reliability helped turn the Forum into the political and social heart of Rome. Economically, the drain supported growth in trade. The more dependable the Forum became as a marketplace, the more traders from neighboring settlements made it a regular stop. This increased contact brought not just goods, grain, oil, wine, pottery, but also news and ideas from other regions. Over time, this steady flow of people and products strengthened Rome's role as a hub in the surrounding countryside. There was also a symbolic dimension to the cloaca's success. In a city where monumental temples and triumphal processions would one day dominate public memory, the Great Drain was an invisible achievement. Its value lay in what it allowed above ground, not in how it looked below it. This invisibility created a quiet pride, the sense that Rome's strength was built not only in visible grandeur, but in unseen, practical foundations. Still, a project required resources and labor year after year. Some of this came from citizens fulfilling civic duties, but much of it depended on enslaved labor from Rome's growing military ventures. This reliance was a reminder that the city's improvements often rested on the toil of those who had no choice in the matter, a reality as much a part of Rome's history as its architecture. By the time the Cloaca Maxima reached its mature form, it had transformed more than the land. It had reshaped the way the Romans thought about public works. If a swamp could become the forum, what else could be remade through planning, engineering, and persistence? Yet, this leads us to another thought. Did the Cloaca Maxima make Rome's future greatness possible, or did its very success set an expectation that the city would forever reshape nature to serve its ambitions? Asterisk. By the time the monarchy gave way to the Republic, the Cloaca Maxima was already more than a century old. And yet, it was not a relic. It was still working, still carrying water, silt, and waste from the city's low points into the Tiber. Few public works of the ancient world matched it for durability, and fewer still remained in daily use for so long. This endurance was no accident, was the result of both its construction and the way it was woven into the city's life. The Great Drain was built with a scale of stonework unusual for its time. Massive blocks of tufa and other volcanic stone were shaped to fit so closely that water could flow without undermining the structure. In later refurbishments, sections were reinforced with travertine, stone that could withstand centuries of damp and shifting weight above. The arching ceilings of some tunnels rose high enough for a man to stand upright, an intentional design that made it possible for workers to walk through and maintain the sewer. Even in the dim light of oil lamps, maintenance, though, was not simply a matter of civic pride. It was necessity. Sediment could accumulate after every heavy rain, narrowing the channels. Roots from nearby trees might pierce the stonework, and debris from markets and households inevitably found its way in. Teams assigned to the sewer would descend through access shafts, scraping and shoveling out the buildup, hauling it to the surface in baskets. It was dirty, difficult work, often done in semi-darkness, yet it was as essential as any visible public duty. The Cloaca Maxima's presence shaped how the city above it was planned. Streets were graded to feed runoff toward its inlets. New buildings in the forum and surrounding districts were often constructed with small drains leading into the larger network. In effect, the sewer became the city's hidden spine, influencing the layout of neighborhoods, markets, and even temples. As Rome grew, the idea of integrating drainage into urban planning became standard, an early example of infrastructure guiding architecture. Its role went beyond practicality. For the Romans, the Cloaca Maxima was proof of what their city could achieve. Writers of the Republic and Empire looked back on it as a monument to the ambition and foresight of the early kings. Poets described it as a triumph of human skill over nature's obstacles. Visitors from other lands were shown the massive arch, where the drain emptied into the Tiber, a place where the roar of water in the tunnel could be heard even on dry days. Here, Rome could quietly boast of an achievement that needed no gold leaf or marble to impress. Yet, the sewer's importance also revealed a truth about the city's relationship with its environment. By controlling the flow of water, Rome had not just improved a marsh, it had altered a natural system to fit human needs. This control allowed growth, but it also created dependence. Without the cloaca, the forum would return to swamp, the market would falter, and the city's heart would clog with mud and refuse. What had begun as a solution became an obligation. The city could no longer live without it. Even centuries later, parts of the original Cloaca Maxima would still be in use. Its stonework incorporated into new construction, its channels deepened and expanded. Few who walked the busy forum thought of the darkness beneath their feet, but it was there, carrying away the runoff of their lives, just as it had for their ancestors. And so, the question remains, was the Cloaca Maxima Rome's first true monument to itself, a declaration that the city could bend land and water to its will? Or was it simply the earliest reminder that every act of control comes with a lifetime of maintenance? Asterisk, long before Rome commanded the Mediterranean, its markets were small, local, and deeply tied to the rhythm of the surrounding countryside. Trade in the early monarchy period was not a matter of massive shipments or fleets of merchant vessels. It was the careful exchange of goods carried in baskets, jars, and sacks, moved by foot, cart, or boat along the Tiber. The forum, made usable by the draining work of the Cloaca Maxima, became the natural gathering place for traders. On market days, the open space would fill with temporary stalls made from wooden frames and cloth canopies, shading both goods and merchants from the sun. Farmers from the surrounding hills would arrive early, leading donkeys laden with produce, or pushing carts filled with vegetables, fruit, and grain. Shepherds brought wool and cheese. Fishermen came with baskets of fresh catch, and potters carried their wares wrapped in straw to prevent breakage. Payment was rarely in coin during these centuries, while some bronze, ingots, or pieces of metal were used in larger transactions. Most trades relied on barter. A farmer might trade a measure of barley for a jug of olive oil, or a potter might exchange bowls and jars for wool to clothe his family. Olive oil itself, though already valued, was often a rare item in the earliest period, brought from more southern regions of Italy, or acquired through contact with traders who had access to Greek settlements. The variety of goods reflected Rome's position as a meeting point between cultures. From the north came Etruscan bronze tools, decorated fibulate clothing pins, and finely made pottery. From the south and along the coast came salt, essential for preserving meat, and, occasionally, amphora of wine or oil from Greek-influenced towns. Even modest households aspired to own at least one vessel of foreign make, a mark of connection to the wider world. The pace of the market was slow and conversational. Transactions were as much about building relationships as about making a single sale. A regular customer might receive better terms, and a trader's reputation for honesty could determine whether he thrived or struggled. Disputes were settled not by written contracts, but by the testimony of witnesses, often neighbors or fellow merchants who had seen the agreement take place. Beyond the goods themselves, the market was a hub for news. Travelers brought word of conditions on the roads, rumors of unrest in distant towns, or news of festivals and religious events in nearby cities. The exchange of information was a kind of trade in itself, one that carried political and social weight. A farmer might plan his planting around reports of weather in the highlands. A craftsman might decide what to make based on which goods were scarce. The king's role in market life was not to set prices, but to ensure order. Appointed officials monitored weights and measures to prevent cheating and kept the peace between rival traders. Markets could be lively, but outright violence was rare. Disrupting trade was seen as disrupting the community's lifeline. Religious rituals marked certain market days, tying commerce to the city's spiritual life. An offering might be made before the first goods were sold, asking for fair dealing and abundant trade. The physical setting of the early market was humble. No permanent stalls, no grand arches, no marble paving. Dust in summer, mud in winter, and the smell of animals and cooking fires were constants. Yet, for the people of early Rome, the market was a place where survival met opportunity, where the products of the hills, river, and distant roads came together in one open space. And so, standing in the midst of this small but vital gathering, one can ask, was Rome's destiny as a commercial power already visible here, in the quiet exchanges of grain for oil, cloth for pottery, and news for trust? Asterisk, as the years passed, the market in the Forum became more than a place for neighbors to exchange goods. It began to draw strangers. At first, these were traders from nearby Latin towns, walking or riding in from a day's journey away. A tea brought goods Rome did not yet produce in abundance. Fine wool from upland flocks, kua from forest hives, cured meats from regions with cooler air for storage. Slowly, the range of visiting merchants widened, and with them came goods that hinted at far-off places. From the north, Etruscan traders arrived with bronze tools and weapons, polished axes, chisels, and spearheads, their surfaces smooth and gleaming compared to the rougher, locally forged pieces. They also brought luxury items, carved ivory combs, glass beads, and finely painted pottery that found its way into the homes of Rome's wealthier families. These were not necessities, but they were symbols of status displayed on shelves or worn on festival days to mark one's connection to the wider world. From the south and along the Tyrrhenian coast came salt and preserved fish, staples in the diet of those who could afford more than grain and vegetables. Occasionally, a Greek merchant from one of the southern colonies would appear, his amphories sealed with resin, holding wine or oil of a quality unfamiliar to most Romans. These visits were rare in the early monarchy, but they made an impression, the taste of a distant land captured in a single jar. The Tiber itself played a quiet but crucial role in expanding Rome's market reach. Barges and small river boats could carry heavier loads than carts over land, and so bulk goods, timber from arbor forests, stone from quarries, and grain from fertile river valleys began to move with greater regularity. Docking at simple river landings, these goods were carried uphill into the city, feeding both the market and construction projects. Trade was not only about goods, it was about habits. Visiting merchants sometimes lingered, staying through several market days, sleeping in the homes of local contacts or in small lodging houses that sprang up near the Forum. They brought new ways of measuring goods, new cooking methods, and even new words. A potter might adopt a Greek design for a vessel, or a baker might learn to mix herbs into bread dough from a traveler's recipe. The expansion of trade also created a quiet change in how Rome saw itself, no longer just a collection of hills with their own rhythms. The city became a point on other people's maps, a destination, not just a home. For the king and his council, this meant more responsibility. Markets had to be kept fair and safe. Disputes between locals and outsiders resolved without damaging future business. A single incident, an unfair exchange, a theft, or an insult could discourage a trader from returning. And with him, the goods and connections he carried. Religious practice adapted to this new openness. Market days were often tied to festivals, and offerings to Mercury, the god of trade and travelers, became more common. A small shrine near the market might see coins left by merchants in thanks for a profitable day, or in hope of safe passage home. In this way, commerce and worship intertwined, each reinforcing the other. The physical space of the Forum began to shift as well. While stalls remained temporary, certain spots became known for particular goods. A corner where fishermen displayed their catch, an area where potters laid out their wares, a stretch of space reserved for livestock sales. These informal arrangements, repeated over years, created a sense of order without formal planning. As traders from farther away began to appear more often in Rome's market, the casual, neighborly exchanges of earlier years had to adjust. When everyone knew each other, trust and memory were enough to settle most deals. But as strangers arrived, men who might only visit once or twice a year, the market needed clearer rules. This was the beginning of Rome's first moves toward a more formal economy. The most immediate change was in weights and measures. Grain was no longer sold only by the basketful, wool only by the arm's length. Standard containers and measuring rods began to appear. These were simple tools, wooden scoops for dry goods, stone weights for liquids, stone weights for balancing scales, but they created a shared language of trade. A merchant from Etruria and a farmer from the Alban Hills could agree on a fair exchange because they both recognized the unit being used. Enforcement of these standards fell to market overseers appointed by the king. Their duties were as much about maintaining trust as they were about punishing deceit. An official might walk through the stalls, checking a trader's weights against the official set kept in the king's storehouse. If a measure was found to be false, it could be confiscated, and the trader fined or banned from the market for a time. Such incidents were rare but memorable, and the knowledge that someone was watching kept most dealings honest. Alongside weights and measures came the first signs of recorded agreements. While Rome did not yet have widespread written contracts, certain deals, especially for large livestock or bulk goods, were witnessed by multiple people, often elders respected in both parties' communities. These witnesses could be called upon later to confirm what had been agreed. In this way, the market's transactions began to leave a trail of memory beyond the two people directly involved. Payment methods also evolved. Barter still dominated, but more transactions began using bronze in irregular lumps or small bars, known as es rude. These were weighed rather than counted, and their value depended on purity and weight. A trader might carry a balanced scale in his pack, ready to weigh bronze against the value of goods. This was not yet coinage as we think of it, but it was a step toward money as a standard medium of exchange. These changes brought new roles into market life. Interpreters began to appear, helping traders who spoke different dialects understand each other. Brokers, often well-connected locals, facilitated deals between visiting merchants and farmers who might otherwise never speak directly. In some cases, these brokers acted as guarantors, vouching for a trader's reliability in exchange for a small share of the profit. With these shifts, the forum itself became more than a marketplace. It became a point of negotiation and record. Certain corners were known as meeting spots for larger deals, away from the bustle of daily sales. The shade of a particular portico or the steps of a small shrine might serve as an informal office where agreements were discussed and sealed. With a handshake or a symbolic gesture, such as the breaking of a small twig to mark a completed bargain, religious oversight did not disappear in this increasingly practical environment. Priests might still bless the market at the start of certain festival days, and traders continued to make offerings to the gods associated with commerce. The presence of these rituals in a place of such growing complexity reminded everyone that, in the Roman mind, prosperity was not only a matter of human effort, it depended on divine goodwill. By the end of this period, Rome's market was no longer a simple gathering of neighbors exchanging surplus goods. It had become a structured environment with shared standards, recognized practices, and the beginnings of a financial system. These were small steps, but they gave the city tools it could later use to manage trade on a much larger scale. And so, as we look back on this quiet evolution, the question is clear. Did Rome's early embrace of structure and trade set the foundation for its later dominance, or was it merely an adaptation to the challenges of dealing with strangers? Asterisk, in the earliest centuries of Rome, an army was not the standing, professional force that would later march across continents. It was instead a gathering of citizens, landowners, and their dependents, called together when the city needed defense or wished to take the fight to its neighbors. Service was a duty tied directly to property. Only those who could afford their own weapons and armor were expected to stand in the front lines. The poorest might serve as laborers or light-armed skirmishers, but they were not the backbone of the force. When the king summoned the army, there was no barracks to assemble in. Men came from their homes on the hills, carrying their own gear. A typical soldier of the early monarchy would have a spear, the most common and practical weapon, and a round shield made of wood, reinforced with leather or bronze. Armor, if he had it, might be a simple bronze breastplate or a helmet shaped from hammered metal. Many fought with only a shield for protection, relying on agility and the strength of the group to keep them safe. The organization was basic but deliberate. The men were divided according to the tribes or clans from which they came, each group commanded by its own leader. These units were then placed under the authority of the king or his appointed war leader. Orders were given verbally, often repeated down the line to ensure they reached every man. The army's structure mirrored the society from which it came, built on personal loyalty, its familiarity, and the authority of elders. Campaigns were seasonal, tied to the agricultural calendar. There was little sense in sending farmers to war during planting or harvest. Instead, most fighting occurred in the months when fields could be left untended without risk to the year's food supply. This meant that war was often short, intense, and followed by long periods of waiting. Armies might spend more time preparing, marching, or negotiating than actually fighting. Waiting was, in many ways, the defining experience of the early soldier. Once assembled, the army could be held in place for days while envoys tried to resolve the dispute without bloodshed. If fighting did come, it might be a brief clash, a test of strength to settle a boundary or avenge an insult, rather than a battle of annihilation. Victory was often measured not in territory seized, but in the livestock, goods, or hostages taken as the price of peace. Even in peacetime, the army's presence was felt. Training days were called, where men would gather to practice shield drills, spear thrusts, and coordinated advances. These exercises were as much about maintaining readiness as they were about reminding citizens of their shared duty. Young men learned from older ones, passing down techniques and the discipline needed to stand firm in a line. The army also played a ceremonial role. On certain festivals, the king might review his forces in the open field, inspecting weapons, praising skill, and reminding all present that their safety rested on their willingness to fight. These gatherings reinforced the link between military service and civic belonging. To be a soldier was to be part of Rome's defense, and therefore part of Rome itself. For the individual soldier, the experience was a mixture of pride and hardship. The pride came from standing in defense of one's home and family, the hardship from the cost of maintaining weapons, and the time lost from work. Yet, in an age when the city's very survival could depend on the resolve of its citizens, few could afford to shirk the duty. And here, looking at this small, part-time force gathered on the field outside the city, one might wonder, was the strength of early Rome in the weapons these men carried, or in the shared belief that they were defending something worth the wait? Asterisk, the earliest Roman army was not yet the disciplined legionary machine that later generations would perfect. It was a militia, shaped by the limitations of time, resources, and the need to return home for the next planting season. Battles were fought with what men could carry, in the formations they could maintain without years of constant drilling. The basic fighting line was a tight formation of shielded men, shoulder to shoulder, spears angled forward. The purpose was simple: present a wall of wood and bronze that an enemy would hesitate to break. Shields overlapped, giving each man some protection from the blows aimed at his neighbor. It was not as rigid or elaborate as the Greek phalanx, but it worked for the small-scale conflicts of central Italy. Each man's position was partly determined by his wealth and equipment. Those who could afford heavier armor took the front, bearing the brunt of the clash. Behind them stood lighter troops, men with javelins, slings, or even simple stones, ready to harass the enemy before the main lines met at the flanks. Faster fighters might attempt to circle around and disrupt the opponent's formation, but the scale of these battles meant such maneuvers were rarely decisive. Asterisk. The king or war leader directed the engagement from behind or slightly to one side of the front line, often surrounded by a small guard of experienced warriors. Communication during battle was by shouted orders, hand signals, or the sound of horns. It was a noisy, confusing environment, and much depended on the ability of small groups to act together without waiting for every command. Weapons were designed for both thrusting and throwing. A soldier might open with the cast of his spear or javelin, aiming to wound or disrupt before closing the distance. Once the lines met, fighting became close and personal. Spear points probing between shields, short thrusts aimed at unprotected spots. Swords were rare and valuable. Most men relied on their spears until they broke or were dropped in favor of a knife or club. Victories were often decided quickly. If one side broke and fled, the other might pursue for a short distance, but rarely far from home. Capturing livestock or goods was more important than slaughtering the enemy. In fact, completely destroying an opponent was unusual. These were neighbors, and tomorrow's enemy might be next year's trading partner or ally. When the fighting ended, the army returned to camp or directly home. There was no long occupation, no standing garrison left behind. The goal was to defend territory, settle a dispute, or secure resources, not to hold land permanently. The army dissolved back into the fields, workshops, and markets from which it had come, leaving behind little trace until the next summons. It was a style of warfare that suited Rome's early size and resources. It relied on cooperation between men who knew each other, on courage in the brief moments of contact, and on the understanding that fighting was a necessity, not a profession. And so, the question emerges from these early battlefields: was Rome's future military dominance born in the skill of its warriors, or in the habit of standing together when the moment came, no matter how brief the fight? Asterisk for all the talk of courage in combat. The life of an early Roman soldier was defined less by the clash of weapons than by the long, slow stretches in between. Campaigns, when they came, unfolded at the pace of men on foot, moving through countryside that was often familiar to both sides. Marches were measured in hours, not miles, and even when enemies were near. The wait before battle could last longer than the fighting itself. A campaign began with assembly at a chosen field outside the city. From there, the army moved together, the wealthier men with pack animals, the poorer carrying their own supplies. Each soldier brought what he could manage: bread or grain, a water flask, some dried meat or cheese. There were no formal supply lines, so resupply meant foraging from the land or buying from villages along the route. This necessity kept campaigns short. A small force could not live off the countryside for long without angering neighbors or exhausting the available food. Marching was deliberate rather than hurried. The army's speed was set by its slowest members, the men with heavier armor or those driving carts loaded with tents, mules, and spare weapons. The path was often uneven, cut by streams, ditches, or stretches of thick mud after rain. The end of each day's march, the first task was to choose a campsite, a dry, defensible spot near water. Men cleared rocks and brush, set up tents or simple shelters, and dug shallow trenches to to guide rainwater away. Camp life was a mix of routine and watchfulness. Guards were posted, taking turns on duty through the night. Fires were lit for cooking, but they were kept low to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Repairs were constant: a strap on a shield, a chip in a spear point, a worn patch on a sandal. For younger men, this was an education: how to keep equipment in working order without access to a workshop, how to share limited resources, and how to live alongside dozens of others without privacy. The king or commander might call the men together for brief drills, but more often, the hours were spent in small tasks: collecting firewood, sharpening weapons, fetching water. Stories were told to pass the time, often of past fights, hunts, or encounters with neighboring towns. In these moments, bonds were strengthened in ways that battle alone could not create. When an enemy was near, the waiting grew heavier. Scouts brought reports, but no one knew if a fight would come in hours or days. This uncertainty was part of warfare in central Italy. Opponents sometimes avoided direct battle, relying on shows of force or raids to pressure each other into negotiation. In such cases, a soldier's main duty was endurance, holding position until the matter was resolved, even when peace was negotiated without a full battle. The army's presence had its effect. A visible, armed force could compel tribute, secure grazing rights, or warn others against encroachment. Victory could be declared without a single spear thrown, though the men might return home with fewer spoils than they had hoped. The march back to Rome was quieter. The pace often quickened as the thought of home, family, and fields waiting for it, tending drew the men on. Once inside the city, the army dissolved as quickly as it had formed, its man slipping back into his ordinary work until the next call to arms. For the early Roman soldier, war was not a profession, but an interruption, a duty accepted as part of citizenship. The days between battles were not wasted. They were the fabric that held the army together, teaching patience, cooperation, and resilience. And so, as the campfires cooled and the men drifted back to their daily lives, one question lingered: was it in the fighting that Rome's soldiers were forged, or in the long, shared silences of the marches and the camps? Asterisk, in the Rome of the monarchy, religion was not a matter of temples filled with incense or priests delivering long sermons to gathered crowds. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, a quiet, constant presence in the home, in the fields, and at the edges of the marketplace. For the early Romans, worship was not so much an occasional act as it was a habit of living in awareness of the divine. At the heart of every household stood the lararium, a small shrine dedicated to the lares, guardian spirits of the home and family. It could be as simple as a shelf in the corner, holding small clay or wooden figures, or as elaborate as a niche built into the wall. Each day, a portion of food or drink might be set there as an offering: a splash of wine, a piece of bread, a handful of grain. These acts were not about lavish gifts. They were about maintaining a relationship with the unseen forces believed to protect the household beyond the home. The fields had their own sacred routines. Before planting, the farmer might walk the boundaries, sprinkling grain or pouring milk onto the soil while murmuring prayers to the gods of fertility and growth. The names of these deities varied. Some were old and local, others borrowed from neighboring peoples, but the purpose was always the same: to ask for a harvest that would sustain the family and the city. The Romans of this time did not think of their gods as distant figures who intervened only in great matters. The divine could be present in a stream, a grove of trees, or a large stone on the edge of a field. Such places might be marked with ribbons, small piles of stones, or simple altars. Travelers passing by would sometimes pause to leave an offering, acknowledging the spirit of the place before continuing their journey. Public religion was still modest in scale, while there were communal festivals. Many were tied to agricultural rhythms, celebrating the first sowing, marking the harvest, or honoring the end of winter's hardships. These gatherings often combined work, worship, and feasting, with the king or priests performing rites on behalf of the city. Sacrifices were made, animals, grain, or wine, not in excess, but in the belief that giving something valuable to the gods ensured their favor in return. The role of priests in early Rome was practical as well as spiritual. The flamens, priests dedicated to specific gods, and the augurs, interpreters of omens, were part of the city's daily decision-making. An augur might be consulted before a building was begun, a marriage arranged, or an army sent out. The reading of bird flights, the inspection of animal entrails, or the interpretation of thunder and lightning could delay or advance important plans. These rituals were as much about timing and order as they were about divine will, a way of making decisions feel sanctioned and safe. Even in markets, religion had its place. Merchants might pour a few drops of wine on the ground before opening their stalls, asking Mercury for fair trade and protection from thieves. Farmers selling produce might whisper a short prayer to Ceres for good prices and healthy crops next season. The gods were not kept apart from commerce, but invited into it, as they were into every other part of life. The sacred and the practical were so intertwined that one could not easily tell where one ended and the other began. To plant without an offering, to travel without a blessing, to hold a meeting without an omen, these would have felt incomplete, even unsafe. Religion in early Rome was not about belief alone. It was about habit. It's about keeping a balance between human action and the unseen forces believed to shape its outcome. And so, the question arises, was it the gods who guided Rome in these early years? Or was it the discipline of ritual itself that gave the city its sense of order and continuity?